All right, we welcome into the show Kyle Madson making his second appearance, Candlestick Chronicles, a Blue Wire podcast, and also recently into the Fired Former Radio
Yeah,
People Club. So welcome.
thank
The
you.
water's warm. There are a lot of us here.
Yeah.
So come on in. I'm sorry that happened to you out there in San Francisco, but there is life past sports radio, as we have discovered here in Purple Insider. And you are still a foremost expert on trade rumors that we're trying to make happen in Minnesota involving the 49ers. So, what is up, Kyle? How are you enjoying your offseason?
Enjoying it quite a bit. The 49ers, luckily, it's never dull. Like there's always something weird going on. So yeah, it's a good I enjoy the time of year between free agency and the draft because you're getting those like the fringes of free agency uh into the draft content, and that's just kind of a fun spot of the year.
It is. It's fun and strange because now we have Meek Mill trying to help Lamar Jackson become a Patriot. And I didn't make that up. That's a real thing that
So
is
wild.
apparently happening. So there's a lot of it is a time where a lot of things get a little strange. So with that, also a time for massive speculation. And with John Lynch at the owners' meeting saying that Brock Purdy is QB1 for the San Francisco 49ers, I have tried to put the brakes on all Trey Lance rumors and say, folks, I just don't
Mhm.
see it. I don't see why they would do it if you're San Francisco, giving a division rival someone you traded so much for. However, if that does end up being the case, that Brock Purdy is QB1, they also brought in Sam Darnold, it does open the door to a potential trade. So give me your view on the landscape of this thing. Like, could Trey Lance be traded? Do you think that that's not going to happen until down the road? Like, what is the deal?
Yeah, so there's a lot of layers here. So just short answer, I don't think he's going to be traded this offseason. And that this goes back to, and you can take it back to 2017. The 49ers have had 1 year since Kyle Shanahan's been their head coach, have had 1 year where they played with one quarterback the whole season. And that's not due to poor play, that's an injury issue. And we saw the injury issues catch up with them in the NFC title game last year. And frankly, they should have caught up with them before that because you had Trey Lance getting hurt in week 2, you had Jimmy Garoppolo get hurt in week 13, and then Brock Purdy, Mr. Irrelevant, turns out to be the best of that trio, or at least the offense operated the most efficiently with him. So I think the Sam Darnold signing was not so much a sign of they don't trust Trey Lance, they don't believe in Trey Lance or whatever. I think that was more of a, hey, insulating them from quarterback injuries, which have been such a significant issue. So bringing that back to where I started, removing Trey Lance from that quarterback room, now Sam Darnold is your QB2 and maybe QB1 depending on when Brock Purdy comes back, and then your QB3 is a rookie, another rookie. Are you banking on that again? So I think Lance is there. And I think this offseason, the biggest thing the 49ers can do is develop him and let him develop. He's going to get all the reps as QB1, at least I imagine he will. So they're going to see what kind of step he takes. And if he plays well through the offseason and through training camp and into the preseason, well, now I think what John Lynch said today, where Brock Purdy's QB1 if they had to play a game today, I think that could potentially change. Now, if he goes into the season, he being Trey Lance goes into the season as the backup, and he's just the backup, and Purdy starts all 17 games, then I think they look at next season and go, okay, well, Lance is going into year 4. His trade value is it's not gonna get higher with him just sitting on the bench. So get something for him and move him now, and then figure out the backup situation with Purdy being the guy. But I'm also not ruling out Lance developing and being a really good player. I'm still a believer in Trey Lance.
Yeah, see, that's the interesting thing. I mean, if you're San Francisco and you trade away Trey Lance to the Minnesota Vikings, and then he throws footballs to Justin Jefferson and becomes a superstar, and Brock Purdy doesn't repeat what he did last year, which I mean would be pretty hard to do for someone like he showed some clear talent for sure. He got the ball out quickly, was more of a playmaker than I think people expected,
Yep.
unless you watched a lot of him at Iowa State. Then you would kind of think of him as maybe being a little more limited than he was. And so he's a great fit for what Kyle Shanahan wants to do. At the same time, if he turned out to be an average quarterback that you can't really win with in a long haul, because we've seen lots of quarterbacks have short-term success, including like Case Keenum with the Vikings, which is kind of what Brock Purdy reminded me of last year. It was like a 7th rounder, and then just everything comes together for the guy. That doesn't mean over 17 games, over multiple seasons, that's going to work out. And already he had several injuries for the 49ers while he was starting, not just the elbow one. I think there was a hip injury or something else involved. So for them, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do it right now and then potentially have it blow up in your face, especially if you're giving him to an NFC team. This has always been my holdup, but looking at it down the road by a year, that is more interesting because the Vikings have one more year left of Kirk Cousins. And if they get left out of the draft party this year, next year's landscape could be totally different where let's say Brock Purdy comes back and he's great and they win 13 games. Then like he's the guy then. They're not moving on to Trey Lance. It is probably smarter if they just wait and see than move him away right now and risk the whole thing blowing up.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because the notion of Brock Purdy just regressing doesn't come up enough. Like I think for the most part he's going to be fine. I think he's going to be a good player. But the Niners drafted Trey Lance to compete with Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen and now Jalen Hurts and this group of quarterbacks that's dual threat and they're turning 3rd and 12 into first downs with their legs and all this stuff. That's why they went and got Trey Lance. That's why they bet on that. And so to just pull the plug without giving him an opportunity this offseason doesn't make a ton of sense. But I think the likelihood that Brock Purdy ascends and gets better than he was this year. I think it was 13 touchdowns and 4 picks and it's just he was unbelievable. So I think it's very much on the table more that he regresses than he gets better. And what does he look like when, and this is the whole crux, this is the crux of the whole Trey Lance thing, is the Niners have this margin of error that's very thin. And they've had a top 5 or 3 or 1 defense statistically. And they have Deebo Samuel and it's Brandon Ayuk and it's Christian McCaffrey and it's George Kittle and it's Trent Williams. And it's this offense and defense. It's this team that's been built to be basically quarterback proof in an era where that's not supposed to happen. So let's project now. Okay, next season, Brock Purdy is, doing Brock Purdy, 2023 season, I mean. Brock Purdy's doing Brock Purdy stuff and they go 13-4 and they go, okay, cool, pull the plug. Trey Lance is gone. But then what happens when George Kittle's gone? What happens when Deebo Samuel's not in the mix anymore? What happens if Christian McCaffrey's unavailable for a stretch of 6 games? And your defense is now a top 14 defense. I don't know. Like, you need Brock Purdy to be the rising tide that's going to lift all boats in that scenario. And it's like, that's where I'm not necessarily sure I believe it yet. That's where I'm not buying it. And I think Trey Lance could ultimately wind up being that player. And I think the 49ers in the back of their minds too have to know that because they're looking out, 3, 4, 5 years ahead. They want to win the Super Bowl next year. Like that's the goal in 2023. And if Brock Purdy gives them a chance to do that, they'll give it to him. But man, I would be really hesitant if I'm the 49ers to just be like, yeah, Brock's the guy, move forward, get rid of Trey Lance. And so I don't know. The regression thing is very much on the table to me.
Okay, so let's say Kwesi calls and says, Kyle Shanahan, I've heard this rumor that you really love Kirk Cousins, that you're a big Kirk Cousins guy. And we can't trade him today, but we can trade him after June 1st. Mm-hmm. So you talk about dead periods of the season. That would certainly inject some fun into the dead period of the season after June 1st. But it is possible when you look at the salary cap situation of the Vikings that they could trade him away then. Kirk Cousins for Trey Lance would be insane and would, I mean, I can't imagine how many podcast listens that you and I would both get if
Oh
it
my God,
happened.
it'd be
But
outrageous.
is it, just considering the situation for both teams, it's become a lot less crazy. I've said all along, no, it's too crazy. You guys are out of your minds proposing this trade. However, if they're not looking at Trey Lance as their starter, and the Vikings have not extended Kirk Cousins, and if he says I'm okay with being traded to San Francisco, which I imagine he would be, as everyone would be, the only holdup would be, if you're the Vikings, do you want to give them a quarterback who could potentially go to the Super Bowl? And then
Mhm.
you're the team that traded. Like, it's not like Detroit, who was tanking when they gave up Stafford and everyone understood it. The
Right.
Vikings don't have a tank roster. So if you're Justin Jefferson, you're like, what? You just gave away that guy. But if you get Trey Lance in returns, your future quarterback, I don't know.
So
Why
what would
not?
his cap hit for the 49ers for the acquiring team would be 10 million? Am I
I
reading
believe
this
that's
right?
right. I believe that's right. Yeah, it
Yeah, and the
becomes
Vikings would
totally
eat 10 and
manageable
a
after
quarter.
June 1. Yep.
Okay. So that makes it a little more interesting. I just don't know if the Niners would want to bring in Kirk Cousins, and because Kirk's not going to come there and just be cool being a backup. And
Right.
I
He would
think
have to be the starter. Yeah.
right, and I think one of the big selling points of Brock Purdy, and one of the reasons that the 49ers have just been like, "Oh yeah, he's going to be QB1 if he's healthy and ready to go," is because the locker room believes in Purdy so much. That was true before he became the starter. And the way they talked about Trey Lance going into last year, it was a lot of like um we're going to do everything we can to help him out. He's a talented guy, but we have a really good roster and we're going to do everything. With Brock Purdy, they were like, "Oh, Brock's the man. Like Brock is the dude. Like we ride with him." So that's one of the issues when you bring up, "Oh, hey, if Trey Lance starts," it's like, how would the locker room take it? If they're trading Trey Lance to bring in Kirk Cousins to start him, this guy that the 49ers have beat in the playoffs, that I think you run up against the same issue, even though like the financials work and Kyle Shanahan likes Kirk Cousins and we know all that. I just I don't think Kirk Cousins would be the guy that they would target if they were going like a player for player swap.
I could see it. I mean,
I,
maybe, maybe.
if Brock, let me go here, because I don't want to like discount your idea entirely. I'm not. If Purdy had the Tommy John reconstruction where he's out for the year or 9 to 12 months or whatever, then I'd be wide open to that being on the table. I just don't know that the Niners are going to bring in a starting caliber guy when Purdy might be ready by week 1.
It just, in making that comparison to Case Keenum, it does make me think, though, that the Vikings had a quarterback, Case Keenum, who was loved by the locker room and had this magical run. And then they went, nah, you know what? We need somebody who's a little more talented. And the thing that I'm sure, if you're Kwesi, you're saying to Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch is, hey, go look how many games Kirk Cousins has missed in his career.
Yeah,
The answer
good
is
point.
almost none. He
Mhm.
missed, since he came to the Vikings, he only missed one due to COVID, and no other games. I think he sat one that was a meaningless game, and that's it. The guy is unbelievably durable,
Yeah,
and
good point.
I don't know. I mean, so I guess it's hard to find not a reason aside from that, unless they think Brock Purdy is just as good as Kirk Cousins, which, when you consider their age, I mean, maybe they could look at it and say, Cousins is not an ascending player. Purdy could be an ascending player. He could do what he did
Right.
last year or get better and so forth, where you can't see Kirk Cousins improving from this. But at the same time, in that short pass type of offense where you just have to read and react and get the ball to your playmakers, like, I don't know, in an all-in situation, you could actually kind of justify it. I just think from the Vikings perspective, they would be really kind of punting on next season and potentially giving the 49ers a quarterback that goes deep into the playoffs, which Minnesotans would never, ever forgive them for if that happened, especially if they got Trey Lance and he didn't work out for them.
Right. The fascinating thing to me with the whole Shanahan Cousins thing, and I guess this is a little bit separate from the conversation we're having, but the way it gets talked about, you would think that Kirk Cousins started 50 games for Kyle Shanahan and went 40-10. He started 4 games and went 1-4. He threw more interceptions than touchdowns. He wasn't very good. So I think that Kirk Cousins, that was like Shanahan's quote unquote like obsession with him. I think that was a 2017 specific thing, I'm sorry, 2018 specific thing, Where Shanahan went into 2017 and said, okay, we'll get CJ Beathard in here in the third round at the end of the third round, and we'll get Brian Hoyer in here, and we'll just like, this is a lost year anyways. Next season, go get Kirk Cousins because he was going to be available. But then Jimmy Garoppolo became available. And Shanahan classified Cousins as a player you can win with in the NFL. And he says there's a lot of guys that you can win with. And I think they look at Brock Purdy and say, that's a guy that you can win with. Which is, I think he probably sees those guys on the same level. I don't think there's something specific to Kirk Cousins that he's like, oh, I need Kirk. I just think he needed a quarterback in 2018 that he thought he could win with, and it wound up being Jimmy. And
Yeah.
then
I mean, I think it would be just the durability and experience would be the biggest difference
Mhm,
there. And like knowing with such a much bigger sample. And remember, Kirk won a lot of games last year.
mhm,
This is funny because I'm sort of like the Michael Scott, like how the turntables,
yeah,
because I know everyone who's listening is like, wait a minute, you have just poured cold water on this idea forever. But when the GM comes out and says, hey, this other guy is our quarterback, and then that guy is also injured, and you're talking about them
mhm,
being all in, and the Vikings are clearly not all in on Kirk Cousins for his future with their restructure. It's like, well, things change. But I did want to ask you before I let you go, though, about just Trey Lance in general.
mhm,
There's such a tiny sample size of him. You mentioned that you think he could still be a good quarterback, and I would not disagree with you there because of the very little experience that he had even coming in. He
mhm,
still needs to develop. But I remember in training camp practices last year watching him and thinking like he's really not seeing it. In fact, Brock Purdy was practicing much better and played much better in the preseason game, or really well in the preseason game.
mhm.
But Lance wasn't really seeing it. I guess I can't blame him for that. Like how can you take much away, or what did you take away from his small sample size of being the quarterback of the 49ers?
So the I it's tough because I believe in his like physical tool set, and there are things that he converted so many like 3rd and 9, 3rd and 10s because of just his legs. And that those weren't even on designed runs. I I think there were things between even week 1 and then the very small week 2 sample because he got hurt so early in that game where you could see him learning on the fly. Like holding on to the ball too long versus not when there's pressure in his face, or pressure in his face and like turning and running away rather than like sidestepping and then stepping up and through the pocket. There were just like little things he was doing better during even just the course of last year, not to mention his 2 starts in his rookie year where you could see a pretty sizable difference. That is why I continue to think like, hey, he just needs to play, and maybe his first year his team goes 6-11. But I think that's what it's going to take for the light bulb to really come on for him. The Niners just aren't in a spot where like they can allow him to do that. They can't go 6-11 with George Kittle nearing age 30 and Debo Samuel with 2 years left on his contract. And like I said, it's all very tenuous. The margin of error for them is not large. So I think if you told the Niners like, hey, no matter what, you're going 6-11 next year, they would just start Trey Lance and see what they could get. But they're not gonna do that. Even if his ceiling's higher. So there were, like I said, there were little things he got better at, and to me, I'm betting on those physical tools. He's got a great head on his shoulders. You hear that all the time. He's very smart, super high football IQ. He just needs to kind of play to put it all together.
Yeah, yeah, and if there were only a place where they were kind of in transition for a roster, so here I am trying to speak it into existence, I guess, because it's very interesting where the Vikings are at. They have flexibility in the future at the quarterback position at the moment, but that also means extreme uncertainty and not knowing where it's going to go. So I appreciate you taking the time to pop on the show, and you playing the role of me for the last like several months of saying like, I don't know, I don't see it, I can't make it happen. But they are, that 49ers team, in a position to potentially compete for the Super Bowl with the
Yep,
roster. So I believe we have Vikings 49ers next year, but we'll check in with each other before then for sure.
sounds great.
Candlestick Chronicles is your show, at Kyle A. Madson on Twitter. A great follow on there. So Kyle, great to get together with you, man. And we will do it again soon, buddy. Thanks.
Yeah, anytime, Matt. See ya.